Chapter 23. What will future population growth be? When looking at the demographic facts with an eye to population policy, one wants to know what the future holds, how great the pressures of population size and growth will be. Hence, governmental agencies and academic researchers make forecasts. The history of demographic predictions calls for humility, however, and teaches caution rather than fear-motivated, overreactive policies. Voodoo forecasting. About 1660, with tongue-in-cheek William Petty extrapolated population trends to show that by the year 1842, the population of London would about equal the population of England. In the 1930s, most Western countries worried about a decline in population growth. The most extensive investigation of the problem was undertaken in Sweden by some of the world's best-regarded social scientists. The dotted lines in Figure 23.1 show how the future looked to them then, but all their dotted line hypotheses about the future, intended to bracket all of the conceivable possibilities, turned out to be far below the actual course of population growth, as shown by the solid line. That is, the future turned out far better from the point of view of those scientists than any of them guessed it might. It may well be that we are now at an analogous point with respect to the world as a whole, except that now population growth is popularly thought to be too fast rather than too slow. The Swedes were not alone in making inaccurate, pessimistic forecasts. A U.S. Presidential Research Committee of eminent scientists reported to Herbert Hoover in 1933 that we shall probably attain a population between 145 and 150 million during the present century. Figure 23.2 shows a variety of forecasts made in the 1930s and 1940s by America's greatest demographic experts. For the year 2000, none of them forecast a population even as large as 200 million people. In fact, the U.S. reached 200 million people sometime around the year 1969, and is far beyond that already. A good many of the forecasters actually predicted a decline in population before the year 2000, which we now know is impossible unless there is a Holocaust. The forecasts just mentioned erred by extrapolating the recent past. Another blunder is fitting the data to the wrong ideal mathematical form, among which the logistic curve has been the most dangerously seductive. It assumes that population will level off. Figure 23.3 shows how Raymond Pearl, one of the greatest mathematical demographers, went wrong. And the graph is coming to us with the approval of Walker Shewhart, the greatest of quality control statisticians. The accuracy of long-run forecasts has not benefited from the huge errors of the 1930s. Figure 23-4 shows how forecasters went wrong in 1965. They extrapolated a large increase for 1990, but a decline actually occurred. Even as late as the 1970s, there were astonishing flip-flops in world population forecasts for the turn of the century, then only 3 decades away. As of 1969, the U.S. Department of State Bulletin forecast 7.5 billion people for the year 2000, citing the United Nations. By 1974, the figure commonly quoted was 7.2 billion. By 1976, Rafael Salas, the executive director of the UN Fund for Population Activities, UNFPA, was forecasting nearly 7 billion. Soon, Salas was all the way down to at least 5.8 billion. And as early as 1977, Lester Brown and his World Watch Institute, which has a close relationship to the UN, dropped the estimate again, forecasting 5.4 billion people for the year 2000, which was surpassed around 1990, if the data are sound. This variation in forecasts must be astonishing to laymen, to wit, that a United Nations State Department forecast, for a date then only 23 years away, when a majority of the people who would then be living were already living, could be later revised by 2 billion people, a change of more than a third of the total forecast. By the time of this writing, in 1992, the latest UN medium forecast for the year 2000 was 6.3 million. Does this example of forecasting science suggest that we should give credence to long-run population predictions? And consider this. In 1972, the President's Commission on Population Growth forecast for the United States that even if the family size drops gradually to the 2-child average, there will be no year in the next 2 decades in which the absolute number of births will be less than in 1970. How did it turn out? In 1971, the year before that forecast by the August President's Commission was transmitted to the President and then published, the absolute number of births, not just the birth rate, was already less than in 1970. By 1975, the absolute number of births was barely higher than in 1920, and the number of white births was actually lower than in most years between 1914 and 1924. See Figure 23.5. This episode shows once again how flimsy are the demographic forecasts upon which arguments about growth policy are based. In this case, the Commission did not even backcast correctly, let alone forecast well. Then in 1989, the U.S. Census Bureau forecast that U.S. population would peak at 302 million in 2038 and would thenceforward decline. But just 5 years later, in 1992, the Census Bureau forecast 383 million in 2050 with no peaking in sight. One gives the lie to the other by about 50 million people, a sixth of the 1989 forecast. The science of demographic forecasting clearly has not yet reached perfection. With a track record this poor, one wonders why official agencies should make any such forecasts at all, especially when they are based on little more than guesses concerning such matters as future immigration policy and people's decisions about how many children to have. We have no experience to rely on for estimating how people will act under the conditions that will prevail in the future. In short, this history of population forecasts should make us think twice or thrice before crediting doomsday forecasts of population growth. Actually, demographic forecasting is very easy. Even movie actresses can do it. Meryl Streep noted that men were given more than twice as many roles as women in 1989 movies. And then she forecast that by the year 2000, we will have 13% of roles, and in 20 years, we will be eliminated from the movies. Some trusting persons respond to data on past failed forecasts by saying that this shows we need better research, and the government should do something about it. But official forecasts made by government agencies, always at very large public expense, of course, have been shown to be no better than the run of private forecasts. And official forecasts have the grave disadvantage that people are more likely to believe them than private forecasts, and then take legal action against the government if the forecasts are wrong, as the timber industry did in the 1980s when an officially predicted tree shortage never occurred. Not only are methods of population forecasting unreliable, but the base of data used for many countries and for the world as a whole is still shockingly weak. In 1992, it was revealed that the populations of several developing countries were much lower than anyone had imagined they could be. Nigeria's population, for example, was said by standard sources to be 122.5 million in 1991. But when the results of the 1991 census were released, quite likely the best census ever done by far, the total turned out to be 88.5 million people. Amazing. Do current trends call for coercive policies? What population size or rate of growth does the long-run future of the world hold in store? No one can be sure. One frequently hears that zero population growth, ZPG, obviously is the only viable state of affairs in the long run. But why? Why shouldn't population get smaller instead of staying level if it already is too large? What is sacred about the present population size, or the size that will be attained if it levels off soon? As one writer put it, the concept of ZPG is simply a careless example of round number preference. As to whether a larger stationary population or a larger and still growing population is plausible or desirable in the long run, the whole of Part 2 of this book addresses that topic. The mere recitation of a number like 5.5 billion people can evoke the reaction that the number is very large, or too large, or unsustainable. But no one says that the numbers of trees or birds or bacteria on our planet are too large, or calculates the number of doublings until their space would run out. Why the difference between birds and people? Contemporary data show us that the rate of population growth can go down as well as up. In many poor countries, including the largest of them, fertility has been falling, and very rapidly, See Figure 23-6. Many of the countries with the fastest falling birth rates are small islands, which seem especially quick to respond to new conditions and currents of thought. Perhaps it is because they have good communication networks due to their high population density. Hong Kong's crude birth rate fell from 38 to 30 in just the 6 years from 1960 to 1965. But huge China is no island, and it supports a quarter of all humanity. Yet fertility there, too, has apparently dropped sharply in the past decade or two, though the coercion involved makes this case different from other countries. The supposed inevitability of population leveling off seems to be an implicit assumption of a scenario like Malthus's two postulated growth rates, exponential for humans, arithmetic for food. But this scenario lacks supporting evidence. Humans and wheat are both biological species, and the growth of each is constrained by various forces. There is no a priori reason why the two species should follow different growth patterns. The recent drops in fertility imply that countries that are now poor and have high fertility rates will sooner or later follow the pattern of the richer countries, whose mortality rates fell years ago and whose fertility rates then likewise fell. This pattern may be seen in Figure 23-7, which shows the well-known demographic transition as it actually occurred in Sweden. In the more developed countries, fertility now is low by anyone's standard. In Figure 23-8, we see that the birth rate is far below replacement, that is, below zero population growth, for many of the largest countries in Europe. What if those trends continue? Forecasts of population size require assumptions about the fertility of future couples, and about the fertility of present couples who have begun but not yet finished bearing children. Such assumptions have proven wildly wrong in the past, as we have seen. Yet it is interesting to imagine the implication of assuming that childbearing patterns like those practiced at present will continue, population decline, in the major Western countries. Already, there is a felt labor shortage in the Western countries, though it may well be that this is a result of short-term ups and downs of the birth rate rather than a result of the long-term rate. And it might be that because of the long-term growth in income, there might be a felt shortage, even if population were to continue growing at a substantial rate in rich countries. This squares with the paradoxical idea that human beings are the only resource whose shortage is increasing over the decades. Even if total population continues to grow, there may be declines in some large geographic areas. This is discussed below in the section on population density. As to the long-run future, again, no one knows what will happen. We can expect that people's incomes will rise indefinitely, but how much of that income will people spend on additional children? And what other activities will compete with bringing up children for parents' interest and time? These factors influence population growth, and no one knows well how they will operate. My guess, based on no solid evidence, is that fertility in the rich countries will again begin to be large enough to produce population growth. We can say with confidence, however, that an extrapolation of the last few centuries' world population growth rapidly toward infinity and doom, as seen in the silly Figure 22-1, has no warrant in the facts. Who will support whom? The dependency burdens. A key issue in the economics of population is the proportion of persons of working age relative to the proportions of child dependence and of old age dependence. A fast-growing population contains a large proportion of children who are an economic burden until they are old enough to earn their keep, just like capital investments while they are being constructed. On the other hand, a population that is growing very slowly or not at all contains a large proportion of persons too old to work, but who require that others support them. The interrelationships among births, deaths, population size, and age distributions have been changing over the years. 1. Figure 23-9 shows that the total number of persons under 20 has risen little in France in over 200 years, and now is little higher than in 1881. But the total number of persons 65 and over has multiplied by a factor more than 6. 2. The total number of deaths each year is no greater than it was in 1950, though the world's population has doubled. Consider the large differences in the child dependency burdens from one country to another. In 1985, fully 46% of the population of Bangladesh, typical of many countries in Asia and Africa, was younger than 15 years old, compared with only 17% in Switzerland, typical of many countries in Europe. That is, in Bangladesh, there were 91 children for each 100 working age persons 15 to 64, while in Switzerland there were 27 children for each 100 persons 15 to 64. The age pyramids for the two countries are shown in Figure 2310. Clearly, the economic effect of such dependency differences is not trivial. Many draw from these data the conclusion that the standard of living will be higher if the birth rate is lower. For the immediate future, this is undeniable. The proposition can be demonstrated by the simplest kind of arithmetic. If income per capita is our measure of economic well-being, then we need only divide gross national product by population to calculate income per person. Adding a non-producing baby to the population immediately reduces the calculated income per capita. It is that simple. The implications of this simple arithmetic are less simple, however. Another baby means there is less of everything to go around, for the time being. But the squeezes in schooling, feeding, and housing, the extent of which will be discussed later, bring forth additional efforts on the part of individuals and institutions to mitigate the squeezes. Also very important in assessing the impact of an additional child is the issue of who assumes which part of the burden, the parents or the public. Later, we'll talk more about this too. The story of dependency burdens does not end here, however. A modern low-mortality society with a low birth rate supports few children. But each person in the labor force also has a great many old people to support. Consider these variations. A. In 1900 in the U.S., 4% of the population was over 65, but perhaps 13% of the population will be over 65 in 2000 and 17% in the year 2020. B. The proportions of the male population within the prime labor force ages of 15 to 64 were 70% in Sweden in 1940 and 52% in Bangladesh in 1985. That is, there were about twice as many workers in Sweden then as in Bangladesh now to support each dependent. But counting the numbers of people in different age groups does not tell the whole story. The cost of supporting a retired person is much greater in the U.S. than the cost of supporting a child. Least important in a developed society is the difference in food consumption, unlike the situation in a subsistence agricultural society. Consider that old people need much more expensive health care than do children. And old people may travel for 12 months a year in trailers on public roads, whereas children cannot. Except for schooling, old people consume much more than do children in almost every category of expensive goods and services. This pattern of old age dependency causes perturbations. The U.S. Social Security system has already been in severe funding trouble, and financing the payments is a serious economic and political problem for the federal government. In the future, the burden of Social Security payments will take up an even larger proportion of a U.S. worker's pay and of the production of the economy as a whole. Even more fundamentally, the deficit in the U.S. government budget, which troubled so many people so much in the 1980s and beyond, may reasonably be seen as a demographically caused phenomenon. If people were still dying at the 1900 mortality rate, there would now be no budget deficit because benefits to the aged would be enormously lower. Or, if couples had continued having children at the fertility rate of the baby boom, there would be more working taxpayers now, and the deficit would not exist, or at least would be much lower than it is. At present, increased immigration is the only feasible solution which would keep the deficit from growing while avoiding the pain of decreased benefits or increased taxes. Are you now, or will you in the future be, a working person? If so, a lower birth rate means that you have fewer people who will look to you now for support. But the same reduction means that there will be fewer people to support you when you get older, and you will then be a relatively greater burden on others. This two-edged sword involves one of the major themes of this book. The short-run effect of a given demographic factor is often the opposite of its effect in the long run. Deciding which demographic pattern you prefer, faster or slower population growth, requires that you put relative values upon the long-run and short-run effects. And this, of course, requires that you decide who is to contribute and who is to receive. Decreasing population density in the future. If one divides the number of square miles on the Earth's surface by population size, an increasing population obviously implies a greater density of persons per surface unit. But this simple calculation is seldom, if ever, a meaningful or appropriate calculation. What matters are the densities that people experience. In the United States, a large proportion of rural counties have lost population in recent decades, and in 1986, the entire state of Iowa had fewer people under the age of 5 than at any time since before 1900. The number declined by fully a third between 1960 and the 1980s. Rural people move to cities, and the people in Iowa worry about it because the trend feeds on itself. The fewer people there are, the poorer the economic opportunities for those who remain, just the opposite of Malthusian theory, and the greater the incentive for them to leave, too. Continued concentration of population could mean that the absolute number of persons living on, say, 75% of the area of the Earth might be declining, even as total world population increases, due to the reduction in the total number of persons needed for agriculture as countries grow wealthy. This is likely to continue indefinitely. See Chapter 6. Consider this. Between 1950 and 1985, and surely continuing beyond 1985, the population density on 97% of the surface of the United States has been decreasing. Here is the calculation that shows this to be so. The total population outside of metropolitan areas fell from about 66 million people in 1950, 44.9% of total population, to about 59 million people in 1985, 23.4% of total population. That is, aside from the roughly 3% of the area of the United States incorporated within metropolitan areas, the total population has fallen. See Figure 23.11. Those who choose to live in rural areas are experiencing a decline in the density of neighbors, and there is little reason to expect this trend to reverse for a long time, if ever. The total urban area may creep up a bit, say to 6% in a century, but in the rest of the country, density may well decline indefinitely, except for vacation uses. The trend is the same for the rest of the developed world, too. See Figure 23.11. Yes, population density within any given metropolitan area will probably increase, but individuals can choose to live in cities or their surrounding suburbs of whatever density they prefer, and the range of individual choices at any density level will increase in the future. Even more important than population density per unit of surface area is the amount of living and workspace available to an individual, and this is continually increasing, in considerable part due to multi-story buildings made possible by increasing income as well as greater technology, as discussed in Chapter 6. Of course, this line of thinking does not comfort those who call themselves wilderness lovers and simply want no human beings there, except themselves. Rivers like the Hula Hula and the Kangakut have lost some of their wilderness character, said George Heim of Alaska River Adventures, a group that organizes trips. You're not getting what you go up there for if you end up sharing the river with 20 other people and jockeying for campsites. One wonders, what is the optimal number of visitors that authorities should allow? 100, 10, 1, 0? And should Alaska River Adventures be given a monopoly on the trade? A cute device used to show that a larger population is a bad thing, based just on population numbers alone, is used by Zero Population Growth in their ratings of the quality of life in American cities. The ratings simply assume that a larger population is bad, and hence it is not surprising that the smaller cities that have no growth garner such headlines as Albany, NY, ties for first place in measure of urban livability. And such publicity leads the mayor of Phoenix to be aggressive about growth control measures. One wonders how the journalistic staff of such an august newspaper as the Wall Street Journal can fall for such simple-minded stuff, unless they desperately wish to believe in it, which leads into the discussion of values in chapters 38 and 39. The doomsday scenario of standing room only suggests a juggernaut inexorably bearing down upon the world, subject to no control. But such forecasts have a very poor track record. The data suggests that not only starvation and disease act to control population size, rather, a variety of economic, political, and social forces are also important. To understand these forces is the task of the following chapter, which will show how such an understanding can help us predict what the future holds in store if we adopt one or another policy toward population growth. Even when we have the correct data, the gross numbers can sometimes be misleading. Some of the implications of the long-run trends, an increasing labor scarcity in the world, and at least for some time a decline in population density in most areas in the developed world, for example, will surely seem strange if stated out of context.